Okay, great. Okay, so I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Nick Kelly, who is from the School of Design, who's going to be talking to us today about personas and empathy maps. For the students, you know that you need to do this in your first assignment. For the marketing academics, this is an area that we're all sort of starting to get involved with, and it's nice to hear from an expert about how personas and empathy maps are actually done. So Nick, I'll hand it over to you. And if you've got any questions, anyone, just pop it in the chat and we can look at that at the end.
Great, thanks Rebecca. And hello everyone. It's nice to be, there's only 20 of you here. I've just come from lecturing my undergraduate subject with about 250 students. So this is a nice small number, so do feel free to interrupt me and ask questions in the chat. And I'd really love to have that conversation as we go. So do just jump in. So I really wanted to talk to you today about personas and empathy maps as well at the end. And I was just taking a look at your focus on designing innovative goods and services. And I quite like that there's probably a whole range of different people here and what your intentions in the future is taking this subject. And you may well end up using personas in completely different ways. So I've kind of focused on the foundations of personas, and I talk a bit about the different approaches and how you use them in different circumstances. But I want to start off with, of course, the big question of why, which is always a good place to start, right? So, you know, in this subject, you're talking about personas for those academics that are joining from marketing today. You've been hearing a lot about personas, and there's always this question of, you know, why does this keep coming up? And I've done some research on personas and a bit of a literature review, and there've been personas as an idea, as a tool for design, have been around popularly for about 25 years now. And the theoretical base for why they're so effective hasn't been studied very deeply, but it's kind of been emergent over the years. And some people, when they see this as an approach, particularly scientifically minded people, they say, why do we use personas when we could use data? And I know that Rebecca's just been talking to you a bit about the difference between market segmentation and personas. So that's kind of a good lead into this. But I just want to start off with an exercise that I give my students to show by an example of why personas are so effective. So what I say is, right, we've got a design task. So, I mean, in the School of Design, we teach all of our skills through just practical exercises, because we kind of want to be growing as designers at the same time as we're learning these skills. So we say, okay, let's imagine that you're designing a kind of a, I just got some pop-ups coming up here. You're designing a kind of a hipster cafe. Think of your favorite hipster cafe, lots of plants around the room, mismatched furniture. You know, it's going to be the next big thing in the local area, but you have a constraint that you have to design it inside a shipping container. That's the space that you've been given. But you can do anything that you want with this shipping container so long as it fits within this very specific space. So that's your design problem, right? Is, okay, you've got to make a cafe, it has to fit within a container, but within those constraints, you can do everything. So just take kind of maybe 10 seconds just to stop and think, where would you start designing this cafe? Just in your mind's eye, just kind of imagine that you've got this opportunity. And now I'll kind of show you where personas come into this mix, because we're going to take this exact design problem and say, okay, here's an extra consideration. This is a woman. She's on her way to an important meeting. Let's call her Marion. She's fictitious, but some kind of a high-powered executive, and she's on her way to an important meeting. That's all we know about her. But now you have to design your cafe for this woman. How does that change your design? Or this is a mother, this is Lucy with her child, and they've just flown in to the city, and they're going to stop by your cafe as a kind of returning home ritual. How would you design the cafe differently within a shipping container so that it works for this mother and child? Is that the same design as you'd use for this woman on her way to an important meeting? And I should stress that all you know about these people at this point is what they look like in these stock photos, and a caption with a few words. And yet you can already start to see that it can change your entire design of what you might plan to do for this cafe. And 2 more people to go. This is a man who, after riding his bike, is going to come to your cafe with his riding group. How would you design that cafe? Would it be different to designing for the previous 2 personas? And the final one, this is a man who wants to use your cafe for a creative session. Sorry, it's got the hair in my eyes here that I'm getting rid of. I'm new to this whole wearing glasses business, so still figuring it out. Okay, so this man, again, he likes to sit down in cafes for a few hours at a time and do some creative work. And how would you design your cafe in a shipping crate for him? So what we've got here, these are actually, we could talk about them as personas. They're super lightweight, you barely know anything about them, but they're already serving this purpose of we can get inside their head and empathize with them in a way for how they might relate to our design in different circumstances. And that's kind of the key point of personas here, is that we can get inside their heads and we can get into different scenarios and imagine how they would feel and act and respond. So that's how I want to frame this, is like, that's kind of like the minimum viable product for a persona, is just a photo with the caption. And so this is the key point. If you learn nothing else about personas, it's that you can't empathize with the pie chart and you can empathize with the persona. If I had a pie chart of kind of the segmentation of how many creatives, how many mums with children, how many executives, that's very hard to use for design. I can get that, okay, I have more of this kind of person, so I should probably make sure that my design works for them. But it doesn't give me anything that I can actually empathize with. And in contrast to that is a narrative. And this is key, is that as humans, we are wired to just latch onto a narrative and enter into that world. I mean, that's what fiction is all about, and that's why it's so successful. This idea of storytelling is in every human culture that I know of, and is just so innate to who we are, of learning about the world, learning about what it is to be human by hearing stories about other people. And it's that kind of hardwired ability to develop a mental model of another human being that this tool of personas is working with. So let me be very clear on that. This idea of using personas, this is one tool out of many that we as designers have in our toolkit. And that's something that I'm going to be emphasizing, is this is why we use it, and this is how we use it, and we use it differently in different circumstances. And like any tool, it can be used effectively and it can be used ineffectively. So we're going to talk about how to use it effectively. So the key point here is that as soon as I show you that any one of those 4 images I showed you, you start to develop a mental model of the person. and you can use that in your designing. So this is a bit of a summary of my 6 key points for why do we create personas. And let's take one of our personas, this man doing his creative work in the cafe, as an example. So the first one is, as I've said, engaging empathy. We create a mental model of who he might be, and then we can use that to like parachute him into different design scenarios and get a sense of how he might respond and how he might feel. That's the kind of the obvious one. Less obvious ones are the fact that once you have a persona, you can use that to communicate something about your design. If I'm in a team, let's say there's like 10 people in my design team that are all trying to create this cafe in our shipping container, this man becomes a reference point. Let's call him Joe, and giving personas a name is useful, right? We're making design decisions where sort of like, should the entrance go on the short side, on the long side? What kind of chairs should we use? He becomes this reference point. I can say, oh yeah, but when people like Joe are in here, that chair is just going to be so uncomfortable that he won't want to sit for more than 15 minutes. And here's where this kind of, someone else might say, yeah, but Nick, look at the segmentation data. We actually can't design this cafe for Joe. It's too small, and we need to focus more on Marion because we want to attract people like her. So someone can say, all right, for someone like Marion, we want stools that they're just going to sit at for 5 minutes while they're waiting for their coffee. Whatever it is, it becomes this reference point. And instead of having to say, my creative type of user, which for you to get your head around that takes seconds, as soon as I say, yeah, Joe won't like that. When we're making design decisions, it's so quick, it's snappy, it just works. And again, as designers, we just use things that work. So the first thing, second thing is communicating in the team, reference points. Third thing is a persistent artifact. So often when we're designing something, it'll take a very long time. Like a classic one of these is like entrepreneurs with some kind of an online startup, is you start out with one idea and it's going to evolve over time. And if any of you listen to these stories of things like Airbnb or even Facebook, how they started out has evolved over a period of time. And as the designers at the beginning of those projects, they have to switch their ideas in so many different ways. A persona is one of these artifacts that can be persistent throughout all of the changes. You might start off with one idea of like, okay, we're going to design our cafe as like the perfect hipster place where everyone comes and sits down for 3 hours every morning. And then for financial reason, your design shifts to be, okay, it's a cafe where we want as many people to pass through the door as we can on a regular basis. But if you've got these personas, you can continue to refer back to them even as your targets of your design has shifted and your ideas change. So obviously those points 2 and 3 kind of work together, right? Helps to communicate, and you can continue communicating over them. Fourth one's a little bit more subtle, bringing absent users into the room. So something that I find myself doing quite often is facilitating design sessions. So if I'm designing something with, say, teachers, often the thing that we're designing is for students, and the students aren't in the room. And I'm going to show you an example of a project that I've worked on with Rebecca and continuing to work on over the last few months, where we're designing for people that aren't actually a part of the project. But by talking to experts, they can kind of work with you on creating personas to bring those absent people into the room. And again, if any of you are facilitating participatory design, this activity of getting participants to create personas is very effective. But I won't go into that in the interest of time. And if you're interested in participatory design, ask me about that later. But this one is a really key point. avoiding elastic users and self-referential design. So I teach first year web design subjects, for example, and I say, okay, design a website, a travel website, go for it. The classic move is that a lot of students design the website for themselves or people like them. That's what self-referential design is. It's basically when you're not empathizing with other people. You're like me and, you know, everybody that I know, my whole group of friends all think like I do, and this is going to be a great design. It'll work perfectly. And then, of course, you release it to the world and you have the shocking discovery that there are people that are not at all like you and they're everywhere. And so using personas, which can be inspired by your other research, is a great way to avoid self-referential design. And are you familiar with the term elastic users? This is about, it's one of these things where as people, we have this illusion that we're able to keep within our heads a whole lot of different people at the same time. So remember how in that cafe example, I showed you 4 potential users of that cafe. Some people would think, right, okay, got it. I've got to make sure it works for all 4 of those people. And as you're designing, you get this kind of idea of an elastic user of, oh yeah, we've got to add in like some bench space so that people that like benches can sit, and we've got to add in some couches near the floor so that women with children can sit. And you kind of get what software engineers call feature creep, where it's kind of you keep adding in extra things that other users are going to need. And a designer might say something like, oh yeah, I'm doing this because the users need it. And you lose this ability to kind of know exactly which users need which things and which users you care about and which users you've decided are not your priority. Because that's a sad fact of designing, is we can't keep all the people happy all the time. Design is always a trade-off of different constraints. So, okay, I've just kind of started off by talking at you for 15 minutes. I'll just pause here for a moment after talking about the why do we use personas in design. And I should add, Rebecca has these slides, so you can refer back to them later at any point. Does anyone have any questions for me at this point, things that weren't clear?
Just pop anything into the chat. One thing, Nick, given that cafes service a range of different people, how, you know, if a cafe operator said to you, well, you know, we have all different people, we don't just have one persona that uses our cafe, you know, how do you deal with the trade-offs? How do you sort of do something that a large enough people can do that it's viable, but yet it's still focused? What advice would you give them?
Yeah, I mean, so that's where it really, I mean, the first advice I'd give is make sure that you've done your research. And again, I can't state that enough, is that like personas are what I think of as kind of a second order design tool, as in you can only create them based on what you already know about the problem. And so in the cafe example, let's say you would talk to nearby cafes perhaps, and you'd find out all of the different users that come, how they use those cafes. You'd talk to people that have owned cafes before. You'd read whatever textbook someone's written about how to set up a cafe. And from that, you'd kind of use that basic research to say, okay, we're going to prioritize this kind of user. And then, because this is of course part of the challenge with personas, is which ones do you create? You need to have that research like market segmentation data to be able to say, okay, I'm going to create these 4 personas and that's what we're going to design for. So it's a good question, because you can only design personas if you already have that research about your subject area. And it's a classic problem, is that sometimes personas are just performative, as in designers do them because they know that personas are a good idea. But if they haven't done enough research, you create the wrong personas with the wrong information, and then they don't help anybody. They're a distraction. Any other questions before I move on? All right. Well, again, do feel free to keep on interrupting me. So this is a bit of an aside, but I think it's a helpful one and I find it interesting. So bear with me. I've just written a paper about it, is why I'm so interested. One way of thinking about why we use personas is that when we're designing, I'm sure you're familiar with the term design thinking, right? It has a very loose definition, but myself and a colleague, John Giro, are trying to kind of give it a more precise definition, where we create this space with two axes, where we say, when we're thinking about problems, we can sometimes be trying to create a very specific solution. So an example of that is like an architect is trying to create a very specific solution, or we could create a general solution. And often in design, we want to create things that are very specific, like specific to a site or specific to a city or specific to a group of people. Or when we're computational thinking, we create much more general solutions, is the opposite end of that spectrum. You do it once, like Google Maps, you write the algorithm, and then you can use that in any city in the world. Similarly, when we're designing, what we're trying to do is enrich the problem space. We're trying to understand the culture, the history, the social space, the politics, the environment, all of these different factors of the problem. So for any of you with the design projects that you have, typically when you're designing something, you're trying to enrich the problem space, as opposed to computational thinking, which is what's down in the bottom right, where you're actually trying to abstract away as much as you possibly can that's unnecessary. And so that's how I think of personas, is they're a really good tool for kind of, yeah, it's all well and good to say that you want to enrich the culture, history, social understanding of the problem by creating personas that have backstories, that have a specific reason for being. It's a tool for doing that. And I see it as one of many methods that expand the understanding. So this is with other things like interviews and empathy maps and flow maps and scenarios and storyboarding, all of these different tools, but personas are a particularly effective one. So that's kind of like contextualizing personas as just one of the tools that we have in our toolkit to understand the context of the problem. And I'll talk more about this in terms of how do we create personas. But when we're creating personas, we're trying to understand the user's goals. And I'll talk a bit more about what I mean by that as we go. But I want to jump into an example of a persona that I created, and to kind of show that there's no sort of one recipe for a persona. I think that's a good example this is a good example of how you adapt this idea of personas to the project that you're working on. I'm sure any of you that have, and I think that Rebecca showed you some examples in the first hour of kind of classic corporate personas that get developed, of kind of who the user is, the brands that they like to use, maybe some of their personality features. If you do a search online for personas, Google search for images, that's what you see. But for any project that you're actually working on, you typically have to adapt this technique to what you're doing. So the project that I'm working on with Rebecca is aiming to prevent homelessness in older women. So this is a real problem for many societies around the world, but particularly for us here in Australia, is that the fastest growing group in society for homelessness is older women. And so we're working with a number of colleagues on a project that's funded by the Queensland Department of Housing to try and prevent homelessness, to try and stop these women getting into a situation where all of a sudden they don't know where they're going to live. And as a part of that, we're working with project partners, which happen to be financial institutions of different kinds, as well as professionals who work in this space of working with women who are in crisis, or work with different non-government organizations who have already been doing work on this problem. Because this is a classic situation in design where, as a designer, I'm coming to this problem knowing very little about the space of the problem. I know that I'm working with experts who have been dedicating their whole lives to trying to prevent homelessness. And so as a project team, we're trying to kind of bring this information from experts and capture it in a way that we can then use it to inform our designing on this project. So what we're actually doing here is we're working now with the financial institutions to kind of create an online portal that they can send women to before they start to be in harm's way. So the important points about this problem are that, number one, we're designing an online portal. Number two, we're actually doing the design work, and we have this problem of the experts are over here. We're designing with the financial institutions here. How can we kind of transfer this knowledge in such a way that the portal that we design works for the financial institutions and contains all the knowledge that we've learned from the domain experts? So it's a classic case where personas are serving this goal of helping us to engage empathy with different older women who might potentially be in harm's way in future. And also as for communication amongst the group. So what we did was develop 4 personas, and the butterfly here is a motif of the project. It's called the Women's Butterfly Project. And so some of the considerations that we used here is, this is a sensitive area where we're talking about homelessness, people who might be vulnerable in different ways. So the idea of using this kind of anthropomorphized person of a butterfly that's cartoon style, that's very deliberately been done so that a whole range of different women can empathize with this character. It's not a photograph of a human being, because then perhaps certain identity issues like, oh, she's much younger than me, or she's a different ethnicity to me, they might stop some women from being able to empathize with the persona. So that's one thing. One more fact that I neglected to say is these personas are also being used on the portal itself for users of that portal to then empathize with these personas. So it's kind of like it's being used to help us design the portal, but it's also being used in the portal for the users, or in a different project you might call the customers, to actually engage with, and they will see these personas. So it's a very particular use of personas, and it's one that I know Rebecca's used in previous projects in this way very successfully. So what we see here is there's a focus on the story of the persona, like what they've been through, where they're at. And here the focus is on when the unexpected hits. Something is happening that's changing the life for this character. And the focus of a story is that we think that it's this narrative storytelling approach that will make it easier for the people viewing the portal to say, oh yeah, that story of Amber, that's just like the situation that I'm in. And there are 3 other personas that they can also empathize with. This idea of support needs won't be shown on the portal, and this is something that we're still working through, but that's included here because these personas are what we call 2-sided personas. It's the same character. This is still Amber, but the one that the designers are using is a little bit more rich in terms of we've got literature and we're showing a link between the persona of Amber and the literature of what we know about homelessness in older women. We're very specifically talking about her motivations in helping other women to avoid homelessness, and her recent change of circumstance. And before we use these in our design groups, they will end up having, these are kind of sliders to represent what the support needs of each of the personas are. And so, as I say, we have 4 of these to represent very particular levels of risk in their different situations, how close they are to being in harm's way. So it's a real world example of how we're using these in a project. So I'll come back to those again after I talk a bit about how do you create personas, because I've been talking about why you want to use them and why they're so helpful. But now I want to get into a bit about how. And if you look at a textbook, it's always a very linear kind of, oh yeah, you just do your research, you look for patterns, and then you create your personas and share them. But as with so many things, the real world example of that is it's much messier, and in effect, designing a persona is in itself a design task. But of all of these kind of facets of personas, as I was mentioning before, you need to have some kind of research that you're going to base your persona on. And I really want to focus here on interviews, because while there are lots of other techniques of kind of focus groups and observation and ethnography, I feel like interviews and extensive interviews are typically the kind of research that a designer would base their personas on. And then I'll talk a little bit more about working with persona data, but effectively you want to use techniques that let you go from lots of research data to a few very specific personas. And in this, the Women's Butterfly Project, that's exactly what I did, was I just talked to everybody that I could, people that worked at organizations that provide shelters for women, people that are advocating for more housing for women, people that are social workers. I couldn't talk to any of the actual women just based on constraints on time in the project and ethics required to do that. But this idea of you talk to as many people as you can and then you synthesize that information into your personas. So I think it's worth very briefly talking about how to interview to get to a point where you have the data you need for personas. I mean, just check in, Rebecca, shall I go into this for a few minutes? Is that worth taking the time on?
The students need to actually do this for their assignment.
Perfect. Okay, in which case I shall. So the aim here, focus on goals first and tasks second. This is something I really want to emphasize, is that there are so many things that you could ask people about, right? When you're talking to them as potential users of your product or your service or whatever it is that you're designing. But you don't want to know everything about their life story. It's very easy to get distracted. And if there's one thing that you want to have in mind, it's that you're trying to understand what motivates this user. Get into their head to understand what they're trying to do and the world within which those goals exist. So an example of this, let's come back to Joe with the cafe. What's his goal? When he goes out, he's trying to find a cafe that he can sit in, feel comfortable, feel that it supports his creative work, feel that he is welcome. I'm really trying to get inside his head and the world. And so now when I get into his backstory, because certainly backstories are important, but it's in the context of those goals. So, well, what kind of artistic work is he trying to do? What other environments is he in where he feels like all of those needs are met? How did he come to realize that working in a cafe is a good way to work? All of these kinds of questions are certainly important, but they are all in relation to that goal. So that's kind of it's a good rule of thumb that what you're trying to get at is goals, and start there in your interviews and then head to tasks later. You know, why do you like to work in a cafe? Okay, then later on in the interview, when you're in a cafe, how long do you spend there? Those kind of specific things, they come later on in the interview. I've got this word semi-structured here just because when we talk about interviews, you can have interviews where everything is very scripted. You've got, you know, your 8 questions, and you know when you go in that you'll ask those and you'll hear an answer, then you'll ask number 2, you'll hear an answer, then you'll ask number 3. That's like a very formal interview. Or you can have completely unstructured, which is just a conversation. A semi-structured interview is you've got some questions that you know you want to get at and some topics that are important, but you're kind of going with the flow of the interview. When the participant says something interesting, you follow up on that and you say, oh yeah, okay, that's really interesting that you entirely, you know, you need to have high ceilings to do creative work. Tell me more about other places where you felt that, or tell me the first time you realized that that was the case. It gives you the freedom to, when you see something that you think has a bit of depth to it, you follow up on it. You kind of take that invitation and you follow it as far as you can go within the time limit. Of course, not as far as you can go, because typically you want these interviews to take often around 15 minutes is the sweet spot for interviews, but it depends on your project and the context of your participant. It's very hard to have a goal. If your participants are happy to talk for 45 minutes, then go for it. That's more information. Okay, so avoid making the user a designer. That's a classic rookie mistake, is like, okay, so if I gave you an unlimited budget and you were designing your own cafe, how would you do it? And it's kind of like, whoa, remember that thing I said at the start of constraints help people with design? That's like the opposite thing. I think there's a Steve Jobs quote about this of, in our focus groups, we don't ask people what they want. We find out who they are, and then we give them something that they would never have thought of. That's your role as a designer. You're not just asking people what they like, what their preference is. You're trying to get inside their heads so that you can create something that's even better than what they can come up with. And that's a really important point of your role in interviewing as well. Try not to get bogged down in specific technology if you're designing for a space that uses technology. But you know, the same would go for any context. With a cafe, don't get bogged down on their preference for round tables over square tables. Try and, again, focus on their goals. If you can get your interviewee to tell stories, that's how you know that your interview is going well. Because all of the richness that they'll inadvertently give you in that storytelling will really help you in your role. And so, of course, ask questions that encourage them to storytell. So instead of, you know, a leading question is like, so tell me what's more important to you, coffee with milk in it or coffee without milk in it? That's like such a closed world question. Whereas if you use open questions like, tell me about the best coffee that you've ever had and the whole circumstance surrounding it. It's like, oh, well, I went into this cafe in Italy once, and you'll get a whole story around that. And you can see how just by asking in a different way, yeah, I'll get that first answer, but I'll get so much more with it. And in many ways, the people that are best at creating personas are the people that have skill at creative writing. They're very, there's a lot of overlap. And again, these are both creative writing and developing personas are skills that you learn. They're not innate skills. It's just this ability to understand people in all of their richness. So, okay, I'm aware we've only really got about 10 minutes or less left. So I'll kind of just race through this last bit to give you time for questions. You'll have these slides so you can go with it in your own time. So these points come from Cooper, Raymond, Cronin, and Noessel. It's a book that we have in our library. On the next slide, I've got the full reference there. and I've given it to Rebecca as well. But basically, another way to think about your questions for interviews is have some questions that are goal-oriented. So ask people about their goals, the opportunities they have for those goals, their priorities in their, with their time and with their day, and the information that they use in making decisions. So they're all goal-oriented, but also ask them system-oriented questions, understanding the whole complex interconnected world within which those goals exist. So asking about function, frequency, preference, things that don't work. Often opposite questions are very effective, instead of just asking people questions framed in the positive, ask them in the negative, and also ask them about their levels of expertise. So again, there's a chapter about all of this in Cooper, Raymond, Cronin, and Noessel. I recommend you have a read of that one. But just really quick tips. Give the participant time, just be at peace with silence and just sit there and see what happens. It's quite magical. Delve deeper, follow threads. Ask for clarification. Like, it's the classic thing. If you've ever heard a radio show and sometimes the presenter, it's almost as if they're acting dumb. They're asking questions that you know they know the answer to. And it's because they're taking on the personality of like the listener that would know the least about this topic. That's your role as an interviewer, is not to kind of be in the know and be on the same page as the interviewee. It's almost to like try and think, is it possible that I'm misunderstanding this in any way? And if there may be clarification needed, then ask the question, because you may be surprised that your interpretation doesn't match the interviewee's intention. And of course, recording and taking notes. So, okay, we've talked about this persona. It's going to go into some more details, but I want to get to empathy maps before we finish up. Just very quickly, some pitfalls, things to be aware of. Why these personas and not others? It's hard to validate your decisions in making personas. So just be aware that you're kind of asking people to trust you, that these are the personas that are important. Second thing is never use personas to justify prior decisions. Like, I made the design decision, then I created the persona, and then I said, oh yeah, this is what Joe would want, so that's why we should do it. That's not how they should be used. Third one, life cycle of personas, is that sometimes, you know, even though they're persistent artifacts in a design, sometimes you need to say these personas are old. They no longer apply in this design, and throw them out. Their life cycle is over. We need new personas for our design. They no longer work. Okay, and I use Illustrator, or you could use Affinity Designer, just in terms of tools for creating personas. You can use anything. You can use pen and paper. You can use really high-powered tools like Sketch or Figma. You can also use PowerPoint or Word. A lot of people can develop personas in PowerPoint. It's not about the technology. If you've got it, Adobe Illustrator is what I use. But again, I think the challenge in this task is not the tech. The challenge is conceptual. And I'm not going to go into a persona. What is a persona? But I've got a definition there that I like from our recent paper. But the important things are that it's fictitious. It's not a real person. It's a composite archetype. So it's not a stereotype, as in just a cookie cutter mold of some category. It's like a complex, rich person. Like this from like it's like an archetype. It's like a prototype of a real person. And it represents a possible user, and it's always based on research. So now I'm just going to finish up by talking about empathy maps, because it's very much a related tool to personas, where often done with the same purpose of we're trying to empathize with our users. Empathy maps kind of go an extra level into that, in that they get us into the kind of sensory experience of being a user. An interesting thing about empathy maps and the relationship with personas is that empathy maps can be done before personas. with real people. They can also be done after you've created your personas with the personas. So you can parachute your persona into a real design circumstance, and you can say, how is my persona going to react to this? So it's the second one that I'm going to focus on today. So these are two examples from, I run a project in my first semester undergraduate subject. If any of you are undergrad students, then you can take that if you want. It's open to everyone. It's DXB 110, which is the Principles of Interaction Design. And in that subject, students design something for an experience for the QUT, which is the technology we've got at Gardens Point campus, a huge interactive screen that people can use as a touch screen and relate to. So the students went into that space and they watched what real people said and did, and they got a sense of all of these quadrants of an empathy map. And there's lots of different canvases. This is, each of the two examples that I show here used different canvases. What's important is that the empathy map canvas gives you a prompt for getting inside the experience of the user. You're trying to understand, first of all, what's the user hearing within this space? So I got my students to actually sit there before the COVID crisis hit, sit there in this space of the cube and listen to what people were talking about and take notes. So this is things like, this is huge. How does this work? Look, you can touch this and it moves. So right here, we're not doing any interpretation. This is kind of, it's very close to research. This is when we're using real people. It kind of is a form of research. When we're using our personas, we could put, say, Joe in the cafe here. And now we're saying, okay, when Joe's sitting in our cafe, what is he hearing? What is he focusing on? And in a similar way, what is he seeing? Seeing other people come in, people sit down and so on. What's he saying and doing? Maybe interacting with the barista, maybe talking on his phone. What's he thinking and feeling? These are just prompts, and it's funny, it's exactly the same when people teach creative writing. These are prompts to use each of our senses, and apologies, there's some power tools outside my window, which is maybe a prompt that I should hurry up and finish the lecture. Take these as prompts to get inside the mind and body. We're hearing, right? We're saying, what am I actually hearing with my ears of our users? And from that, you can sometimes, there's no need to do this. Sometimes people go into this kind of extra category of what's the pain that the user's feeling? What are their needs and their gains? And finally, what's their goal? Because all of this comes back to what they're trying to do. And here's another example, totally different canvas, just to kind of, and again, I know that Rebecca's given you a different canvas entirely. Don't feel like you're tied to the canvas. You can design your own empathy map inspired by the canvas Rebecca's given you. The point is that you're stating who you're empathizing with, who is the person at the center of your empathy map. What are they seeing? What are they saying? What are they doing? What are they hearing? And there are some optional categories here where they're talking about what are they doing, pains, gains, motivations, thinking and feeling. So it's like an extra step that you can go to place your persona in a design situation, or as the step before personas as a part of your research, are ways to use it. So I'm aware that I've gone over time and I want to leave at least a few minutes for questions. So first of all, do feel free to email me if you've got any questions about any of this, that you've got the slides. And while we're still here, does anyone have any questions or follow-ups